curfew could not quell the violence, neither could the National Guard. Last night, 2 men were shot in Ferguson, Missouri, and there are conflicting reports about the number of arrests, with some outlets reporting there were as many as 78 people taken into custody. Now, after more than a week of rioting, the White House is sending Attorney General Eric Holder there to oversee the federal investigation into the death of 18-year-old Michael Brown. This as Captain Ron Johnson of the Missouri State Highway Patrol continues to call for peace. But in Ferguson, the relationship between law enforcement and the community is fractured, and many are pointing to the predominantly white police force as a big part of this problem. Ferguson, Missouri has undergone a shift during the last 20 years. Its black population, which in 1990 was just a quarter of residents, is now 2/3. But the police force has yet to reflect the new Ferguson. It includes just 3 officers of color, and some argue that lack of diversity is reflected in the clashes that have taken place in the wake of the Michael Brown shooting.
We were walking peacefully down to the mall. This is unacceptable, and this is not the law.
It's why, amid the strife, Missouri State Highway Patrol Captain Ronald Johnson has emerged as the face of local law enforcement.
And I am not going to let the criminals that have come out here from across this country or live in this community define this neighborhood and define what we're going to do to make it right.
Striking the balance between law enforcement and community building is something Cambridge police officer Michael Danilick has been doing during his nearly 2 decades on the job. Danilick works with many Cambridge youth of color through the department's community policing program. Danilick's own roots have given him a special perspective.
Growing up where I grew up in a housing development, I always knew that I didn't have the greatest relationship with police officers, and I wanted to make sure that things were changed if I ever got the job.
Danilick says the results of the outreach his department does can be seen when police and youth interact in public.
Kids can come up to you and say, "Hey, coach," and when you're in uniform, instead of something, looking at, it's like, oh, there's the police officer and it's kind of an us versus them. It breaks down a lot of those barriers.
As protests continue, a global audience now watches to see if Ferguson can also break down such barriers. Here in Boston, we're seeing a push to promote more minority officers to sergeant. My next guest has been a vocal advocate for that change. Larry Ellison is a detective with the Boston Police Department and president of the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers. And welcome to Greater Boston, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Why is it so important that a police department reflect the community that it serves?
Well, I think as you see in Missouri, it's important because the numbers there reflect that the population is predominantly people of color. Actually, it's a little bit more than 50%, but the police department is not reflective of that. And I think that helps sometimes because there's a cultural difference that we all have, but isn't shared when the diversity is not there.
Well, let's bring in Brian Keyes. He is the chief of the Chelsea Police Department, a position that he's held since 2007. We want to say thank you very much for being here. And let's take a look. I want to show you this graphic of the population of Chelsea, and let's compare that to the makeup of Ferguson. More than half of your city's population is Latino, and Ferguson, that's close to the same percentage being African American. Do you take those figures into account when you're training officers and you're hiring officers, sir?
We do. We have certainly for a number of years. In Chelsea, currently we have 103 police officers. Our breakdown in terms of Latino officers is approximately 30%. I started the job in 1987, and when I did, we had 1 Spanish-speaking officer at that time. The demographic of the city certainly has changed dramatically over the years, and we've tried to do our best to really increase the numbers of Spanish-speaking officers to really keep pace with the growing demographic in the city. And in terms of somewhat different, I guess, than Ferguson, our big challenge was the language. We need officers that speak Spanish. We have 55% of our population that's foreign born, and then there's a greater number that's second generation people from Central America and South America. So the language is very important for us.
Which I'm sure in Boston you have some of that same thing.
We do, and as a matter of fact, at times when there's needed, they'll call for a special language cert because the population, we have a Haitian, we have a Jamaican, Dominican. Boston is the melting pot of diversity, but the police department is not reflective of that.
So you don't think that Boston is reflective?
I don't think it is. The numbers, if you look at the numbers as far as captains, sergeants, lieutenants, that 90% of the captains in the Boston Police Department are white males, 80% of the lieutenants are white males, and 80% of the sergeants are white males, and it's very few women that are supervisors in the Boston Police Department.
And do you see that as a problem when you're talking about being out on the streets and policing?
Absolutely, because a lot of times, as the chief will probably attest to, that the first person that people see when there's an incident, when someone's called, is a supervisor, and that is the person that lays the foundation for how that investigation is going to proceed. And a lot of times, it doesn't look like the person who's being serviced.
Let me talk to the two of you about the militarization, if you will, of police departments, which in Ferguson, a lot of people would argue has heightened the tension there. Do you think there is a place for this kind of policing?
Well, I think that, safety and security has to be above all. I think in terms, I know it's kind of been raised recently as an issue in terms of the weapons that officers are deploying, the style of dress that they're wearing. Whether it be the helmets and so forth and some of the high-profile gear, but at the end of the day, officers have to be safe. I think that what you've seen rolled out in the media in Ferguson, this is obviously a high-profile incident. People that involved in riots and different things, and you don't see that whether it be in Boston or Chelsea or Cambridge on a daily basis. Officers aren't dressed in this type of attire. It's only when it's a high-profile incident, and the officers they have to be safe. At the end of the day, and this type of outfit, keeps them safe.
But Detective, you can understand why that might heighten, frenzy on the street when suddenly you see someone coming and they look like they're ready for war.
I think in this instance it was deployed too early. I think the chief is right. We definitely need those resources. But these people originally were protesting peacefully, and then you see all of this heavy equipment coming, and for what? People have a right to assemble lawfully and peacefully, and I think they weren't given that initially, and so that did escalate the situation.
Well, when we're talking about equipment, let me tell you a quick story here. In Rialto, California, a lot of the officers there are wearing these mounted cameras on their person, and shortly after they equipped the department with these, they found that force by officers was down 60%, and citizens' complaints about officers was down nearly 90%. So is this the kind of maybe equipment that officers in departments need more readily?
I love them. They're called body cameras. We don't have them in the city. Certainly, it's with technology, trying to keep pace with technology. It's something I would love to have. You just cited this statistics. You just think of it. That if an officer is inclined to act a certain way, and let's say it's a little bit left to center, if they have a body camera on,
a third set of eyes.
Correct. They're going to be just running right by the numbers, and I think it's a great tool.
But also, I think to speak to that as well is that it avoids false claims, because if people know their documents, sometimes people are making false claims against officers, and there's no one there except the two people. Now you have an independent eye viewing the situation.
In fact, that was part of the statistics in California. They had fewer people who actually tried to complain, as we said, because they knew it was on camera and they knew what had occurred there.
Correct.
So
basically just an extension of the in-camera video systems that have been around for years, where motor vehicle stops on highways and so forth. You see them a lot by the state police in different jurisdictions, that the number of complaints, and albeit usually with motor vehicle stops and OUIs, people drinking, goes down, because the true picture of what occurred is there, and it can't be really disputed.
I want to thank both of you for being here. This is discussion. Unfortunately, as it continues in Ferguson, we have to continue to have this discussion. We hope maybe we can have it in a positive way here very soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.